going to introduce now our next speaker, Professor Manita Chatterjee. And Manita completed her graduate studies at Jagatpur University in Calcutta and received her PhD from Syracuse University in 1994. She then spent the next 10 years at the House Ear Institute in LA and then moved on to the University of Maryland for 4 years. In 2012, she started at Boys Town, where she is now the Director of Auditory Prostheses and Perception Laboratory. And so please welcome Manita to the stage, and we can all enjoy the second part of this research symposium. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Peter, and many thanks to the organizers for putting this session together and for inviting me to present our work here. I'm going to just make sure, yep, that's good. So I'm going to talk today not about binaural hearing, fortunately, but you've heard quite a bit about it today, I think. So we can move a little away from that and talk about some of our work on voice emotion recognition by children and adults with cochlear implants. So this is an area that hasn't received, it's been somewhat understudied, and the reason I think is it's understandable that, you know, when hearing prostheses have been developed, particularly cochlear implants, the focus has been on restoring speech recognition to the listener, right? What is it that is being said? And that's an understandable first priority for device development. But as a result, in cochlear implants, the issue of prosodic cues, you know, how did the person speak? Who was the speaker? What was their mood? What was their communicative intent? Things that may not be immediately, that information may not be available in the words that were spoken. So the how of speech, right? That part is not really well represented in cochlear implants. The reason that is the case is that in cochlear implants, voice pitch, which is a really important acoustic cue for these prosodic cues, for this prosodic information, voice pitch is not very well transmitted in present-day cochlear implant technologies. And so cochlear implant patients are, you know, they have pretty good speech recognition, particularly in quiet, maybe even a little bit of background noise, but when it comes to something like voice emotion communication, or was the person asking a question or making a statement, those kinds of things, cochlear implant patients have some difficulty with. And so that is going to be the focus of my talk today. And I think we would agree that for full communication, we do require both. And now that our devices have done so well in restoring the what of speech communication to individuals who are hard of hearing and deaf, perhaps it's time to turn our attention to communicating voice pitch information better. So cochlear implants work in such a way that many phonetic cues, not all, but many phonetic cues are well represented. But pitch requires this rich harmonic structure of voice that is beautifully encoded in the cochlea, in the normal cochlea. But our cochlear implants, with their limited set of electrodes, with huge amounts of current spread, so you know, electrically stimulate a particular electrode, that current spreads to regions far away from that electrode. And so neurons that are not supposed to be telling the brain about what's going on at that electrode end up doing so. And so there's a lot of distortion and smearing of that, the representation of that harmonic structure. And so it's very difficult for cochlear implant patients to access that information well. There is a kind of voice pitch information that is available to listeners with cochlear implants, and that is in the form of the periodicity of the temporal envelope that is extracted from each frequency band before it's transmitted to individual electrodes. Now, that periodicity does convey a kind of pitch, but it's not very salient. And studies, as long ago as in the 70s with normally hearing listeners showed that that form of pitch does not support melody recognition, does not support a lot of the functions that we require of voice pitch in our everyday speech communication. It is a weak cue that cochlear implant listeners are dealing with. So I'm going to play you some examples of sentences spoken with different emotions.
The tall man tied his shoes. The tall man tied his shoes. The tall man tied his shoes.
So these three utterances convey rather different emotions, right? And you hear different things about the mood of the speaker saying the same sentence, right? So the what and the how are often interlaced in speech, and we need to hear those things. So here's the voice pitch, sort of a hum that we've generated based on those utterances. So here I've taken the what away from it, and you're just hearing the how. Right? And so this information is the stuff that we want to give cochlear implant patients, but the devices don't as yet. If you have some residual acoustic hearing, the low frequency hearing does provide you with this information. And so listeners who have a cochlear implant in one ear and maybe a hearing aid in the other ear, or are using hybrid devices, may have better access to this information. So our primary focus is on cochlear implants. We're interested, today I'll be focusing on emotional prosody and its communication. And I'll show you a little bit of data of how children with cochlear implants are producing vocal emotions. Because we feel like this emotional communication is something that's very important, in, particularly in children developing with the device. We expect that it contributes to social development, social cognition, peer-to-peer interactions, quality of life, etc. And there is some evidence for that already in the literature. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is that these kids that we're studying have had very little acoustic input, right, since birth. And most of them have been implanted fairly early in a time period when the brain is maximally plastic. So the brain is very adaptive. So there are interesting questions we can ask about how this plasticity of the brain is helping the child perhaps overcome some of the limitations of the device. We don't know. Linguistic environment may be something that matters, so we have a collaboration with colleagues in Taiwan where we're looking at lexical tone recognition and pitch perception with children with cochlear implants. And one of the things we've been finding there, we have a manuscript in preparation, is that those kids growing up in Taiwan, even the kids with CIs, have a little bit of an advantage over kids growing up in speaking English in the US in terms of processing voice pitch changes and labeling the direction of change in voice pitch, because tonal languages require you to do that. In order to understand the meaning of a word, you have to be able to identify the voice pitch inflection that accompanies it. So there's a lot of interesting questions we can ask. We're always comparing our kids with cochlear implants with another interesting population, which is adults with cochlear implants who became post-lingually deaf. So these adults had, they developed language, spoken language through good acoustic channels, since birth, and then lost their hearing much later in life and then got a cochlear implant at a time in their life when the brain is not as plastic, not as adaptive. So they are having to adapt now to this degraded input in a new way. So it's a very interesting comparison. But those post-lingually deaf adults have established their concepts of emotion, language, etc., through normal acoustic channels, whereas the kids with cochlear implants who are pre-lingually deaf are having to establish those patterns and concepts through the very degraded input from this device. So this is the things that we are very interested in. And at the same time, you know, there is a brain attached to the ear, so cognitive and linguistic development is going hand in hand with adapting to and, you know, this degraded input as the child develops. And so it's very interesting to think about. I mean, I won't have these answers for you today, but cognition and language, which are developing through this degraded input, are also being harnessed to in top-down repair mechanisms, right, to recover or fill in the missing information coming from this device, right? So this two-way game of this degraded input, which helps develop and establish cognition and language, but also is being restored by top-down action by cognitive and linguistic systems. Things just we have to keep in mind as we do our stuff. Just to give you a sort of a big picture view of what gets us excited about this work. So I'm going to present to you data on emotion recognition, so vocal emotion recognition by children with cochlear implants. We started with child-directed materials, which has exaggerated prosody. And the reason was we thought, you know, before we had tested with children, we thought that, you know, listeners with cochlear implants, particularly children, might really struggle with these tasks because we knew already that pitch perception, voice pitch perception was so limited in these populations. So Danielle Zion, who's now at Walter Reed, was a student in my lab and got us going in this direction. So I always have her picture up when I present this work. So we picked 5 emotions that we felt a 6-year-old would be able to identify. The target age group is 6, is the youngest, and 18, 19 are the older kids. We're afraid of testing kids younger than 6 in our lab, so we stick with 6. In this data set, the stimuli were recorded by 1 female and 1 male talker, and again, we asked them to read these 12 sentences that were picked from the hint corpus. They were pretty emotion neutral, so we avoided sentences like the big dogs can be dangerous and stuck with things like the cup is on the table. And we asked the talkers to imagine a scenario that would evoke that emotion and then read the sentence with that emotion as if they were addressing a 6-year-old child. So the prosody is exaggerated, and we have confirmed that with our acoustic analyses. So here's some examples.
They're going out tonight.
Sorry if it's really annoying.
They're going out tonight. They're going out tonight. They're going out tonight. They're going out tonight.
Yeah. So you see that in emotion communication, multiple cues come into play. It's not just voice pitch, right? We talk louder or softer, we talk faster or slower, right? So there's multiple cues. And so one of the things I was very interested in is, would the listeners with cochlear implants be able to compensate? Would they be able to rely more on something like intensity or duration cues? And, you know, if pitch is so degraded that they can't use it very well. So one of the things we always do with these kinds of studies is test listeners with normal hearing who are listening to cochlear implant simulations. Okay? Now these simulations, you know, don't get us all the way there ever. But in this case, we used noise vocoded speech, which has been used for in numerous studies looking at speech perception with cochlear implants or degraded inputs to the brain. And these stimuli, you'll hear some of them. You may have heard them before. What they do is they sort of simulate the kind of degradation that a cochlear implant processor or a cochlear implant device does. So the information is similar, but the quality of the sound is really quite different from what a cochlear implant patient would hear. A cochlear implant patient would hear something that's probably more robotic, okay, than what this just sounds like noise. But these kinds of simulations have done a very good job of approximating performance by cochlear implant patients. And so they continue to be used a lot in research. So this is a different sentence. And I've noise vocoded it with 8 channels, which means that, you know, it's pretty degraded. If I had 16 channels, it would be less degraded. If I had 4 channels, it would be more degraded. Okay. What is the sentence? Does anybody know? Not so bad, right? So with 8 channels, you can kind of tell what it is.
They took some food outside. They took some food outside. They took some food outside.
So you see that you've lost a lot of the vocal characteristics, but you do have things like intensity and speed of talking. Sorry. So there is information out there, and these are the original.
They took some food outside. They took some food outside.
And so on, okay? So there's something more I wanted to say here. No, I think we're good. We'll come back to it if needed. So we had our listeners, and we have 4 groups here, as you see, 4 symbols in the graph. We had normally hearing adults who listened to the original speech, which is shown in this full spectrum, this full condition to the right here. Okay. I wonder if you can see the arrow. Then we have our, sorry? No arrow, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll just describe it. So we have the full spectrum condition is the original speech sound, which is to the right. The pink circles are showing you the data with the normally hearing adults. And you see that as we go from right to left with the pink circles on top, okay, so these normally hearing adults are doing great with the original stimuli, which tells us that our emotion stimuli are conveying the emotions correctly, and we confirmed that with other analyses as well. So happy was identified as happy by our normally hearing adults. These are kind of providing a control set for us, right? And then as we degrade our stimuli, going from 16 to 8 to 4 channels, performance declines, and that's what you would expect. The blue circle to the right, okay, shows you the mean performance of 9 post-lingually deaf adults, right? So the blue circle to the right there. And the green triangle right on top of that blue circle is the mean data from 36 children with cochlear implants, right? And they're again aged 6 to 18 years of age. And you see that those kids with cochlear implants and these post-lingually deaf adults, there's a deficit, right, compared to the normally hearing listeners, that pink circle on top. But we didn't see much difference between these 2 populations. So even though they bring very different brains to the table, you know, the kids, pre-lingually deaf kids, are developing with the cochlear implant, whereas the post-lingually deaf adults have developed these language and cognition through normal acoustic channels. Performance with this device, the mean performance, you know, we didn't see differences. What was interesting are the white squares. Do you see them? The one on the right are the mean data of children with normal hearing listening to our original unprocessed clean speech samples, and they do just as well as the adults with normal hearing. So the white square on the right is right, you know, almost the same as the pink circle, the adults with normal hearing. But you see the white square down here at 8 channels, right? So the kids with normal hearing are struggling to decode the emotion with 8-channel noise vocoded speech compared to the adults with normal hearing. So the adults with normal hearing are doing really great. I'm going to see if I can recover, and I'm going to go into dangerous territory here. Okay, there's my pointer again. Okay, so the kids with normal hearing are having real trouble with this 8-channel noise vocoded materials, right? So the adults with normal hearing with 8 channels are doing about the same as our listeners with cochlear implants. And that's what's sort of been shown in the literature with various speech recognition measures in cochlear implant listeners and adults listening to cochlear implant simulated speech. So these kids with normal hearing have never heard this stuff before, but neither had the adults. And this really, we saw this significant age effect. So as the children with normal hearing developed, they did better and better with this cochlear implant simulated speech. And I'll come back to that later. The other thing, too, is that the kids with cochlear implants who've developed with this device, right, are doing so much better than the kids with normal hearing listening to the CI simulated speech, right? And this, I think, I would suggest, speaks to the benefit of experience with that degraded input, right? So we're very interested in the variability, right? So if you look, those means and standard deviations look really nice, but if you look at the individual data, so here's percent correct scores, and so these are the same data that I've plotted here, except now I've broken them up into individual listener scores. The horizontal axis doesn't mean anything. It's just the order in which each person was tested. And the blue circles are showing you the performance of kids with cochlear implants. The red squares are the adults, postlingually deaf adults with cochlear implants. Here I have these lines, right? These show where the normally hearing listeners, their mean performance with the original speech, and then 16 channels, 8 channels, and 4 channels, so increasing levels of degradation, just to give you a framework against which to compare these kids. And you see this range of performance, right? So these kids with cochlear implants and adults too, so many are doing way better than 8 channels, right? They're doing really well, even better than 16 channel noise, which is fantastic performance. But so many are falling below 8 or 4 channels. So this variability is something we're very interested in. Something else I should again highlight is that the stimuli had exaggerated prosody. So this was child-directed speech, right? Kids who are 12, 13, 14, people aren't really talking to them in that way, right? So think in everyday life, the true deficit, is underestimated here. So we're very interested in these predictors of performance, and some things we've been looking at, and the top 3 we have some information about. So for instance, we have been finding that the children with cochlear implants, their sensitivity to pitch changes, voice pitch changes, static and dynamic, is a very good predictor of their performance in our emotion recognition tasks. We do see that age-related factors, for instance, duration of experience with the device, can matter, not hugely, but they do matter somewhat, and it depends on our task, what we're doing. Cognition and language we are very interested in, and I'll show you a little bit of data soon. Socioeconomic factors probably matter quite a bit. We haven't pulled all our data together. We have been collecting it, so I don't have that answer for you at present. So here's a slide showing the prediction of performance in our voice emotion recognition tasks, the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is performance by normally hearing children, children with CIs, normally hearing adults, and adults with cochlear implants on our various pitch discrimination tasks. And the correlation is very strong, and whenever we look at this, it's predictive. So what's interesting here is that even though voice emotion comprises so many cues, there's voice pitch, there's intensity, right? We talk louder or softer, as I said, or faster or slower. Voice pitch remains a dominant cue. And when we do acoustic analyses of our stimuli, and we can do certain analyses to see which acoustic cues are most important for vocal emotion, we see that voice pitch remains a dominant cue. So the fact that the cochlear implant is not transmitting this information is problematic, because these kids and these adults are having a hard time compensating, even though those other cues are present, right? So I wanted to show you a little bit of our age, cognition, language factors. So this paper just came out in Ear and Hearing. Anna Tinnemore, who's presently doing a PhD at the University of Maryland, was in my lab for a summer, and she led this work. So here we just looked at children with normal hearing to try and understand what are the factors that make them have such a difficult time with cochlear implant simulated speech. And remember how the kids with normal hearing were struggling with 8 channels noise vocoder speech. So Anna confirmed that. So here's the age of the normally hearing children. So after 2021, these are data from adults. And this is again percent correct scores. And we have the 8-channel data in blue, 16 channels, which should be a lot easier, in red, and then the full spectrum original stuff in green. And you see that there's a significant age effect, but in addition, we found that nonverbal IQ, cognition, is an important predictor as well, a significant predictor. So even though all the kids had good, scores in their nonverbal IQ, it was a predictor in how well they were able to decode the emotion in this cochlear implant simulated speech. So we went on to ask, in our study, we didn't see that language was predictive. So it might be our measure of language. We were using PPVT scores. So in these cases, the test might be more or less sensitive to certain aspects of things, right? So with children with CIs, with our collaborators at UCSF and Charles Lim's lab, Karen Chan Barrett led this work. We're working on the manuscript now. So with 27 children with CIs, that same age range, now we looked not only at child-directed speech, but also at adult-directed speech. So with adult-directed speech, the prosody is more muted. We have, again, a male and a female talker, and the most important things are that the kids with CIs, of course, did much better with the child-directed speech than with the adult-directed speech. Again, they showed similar performance as we had seen before with the child-directed speech. And when we looked at predictors, again, nonverbal IQ showed up, just as with the normally hearing kids, predicting their performance with cochlear implant simulated speech, with the cochlear implanted children listening to clean speech in our emotion recognition task. Nonverbal IQ seems to be somewhat of a predictor. And with adult-directed speech, which is harder, the prosody is more muted, the duration of experience with the device did matter. Okay. So how much time do I have? Oh, perfect. Okay. So we've been doing some work to see how well these kids are communicating emotions, okay? So now I have to tell you that, I am not a linguist. So in our lab, we're kind of more engineers in our approach. So we're kind of making stuff up. But luckily, we are at Boys Town, where we have amazing people like Ryan and Mary Pat Moeller, and so they make sure we don't screw it up too bad. So, so we made up a list of 20 sentences that were very simple, things like, this is it, she is here, and so on. And sentences that a 6-year-old could read. And then we invited children with cochlear implants and children with normal hearing and adults and all the same populations that you've been seeing data with into the lab. But the focus really is on the kids with cochlear implants. And we asked them to read those sentences in a happy way and in a sad way. Okay? And we gave them no examples, no training, no feedback. Whatever they did, we said was great. So we did give them feedback. It was very enthusiastic feedback. And we made recordings of these productions. And then we did 2 things with those recordings. We did acoustic analyses. So what is the voice pitch? How much does it fluctuate? What is the duration? And so on. And also, we brought in children with normal hearing, other children with normal hearing, and had them listen to these productions, okay, and tell us, did it sound happy or sad? Yeah, so we have an objective measure. So even we have these nice acoustic analyses, but they may not capture, how well the child is actually communicating the emotion. So, so these are the amazing people that have made this happen in our lab. So I'm showing you data now with, the recordings are from 13 children with cochlear implants and 9 children with normal hearing. So I wanted to actually play you some examples of these kinds of productions. So we chose happy and sad because they're highly contrastive on every dimension, okay, that we can measure. So we talk louder when we're happy, softer when we're sad. We talk with a higher mean pitch when we're happy, so our pitch actually goes up, and lower mean pitch when sad. We talk with more pitch modulations when we're happy. We talk more of a monotone when we're sad, right? So many dimensions. They're very contrastive. So we felt that, and also for children, a 6-year-old, happy and sad, these are tangible emotions that they can handle, right? So those were our reasons for picking these 2 emotions. So here's some, I think I have to get out of this again. And let's hope this works, yes. Okay, so this is a normally hearing child, 11 years old, and here the graphs are showing you the pitch contour, and this is time, okay? The red is for happy and the blue is for sad.
This is it.
So the sentence is, this is it, and that's her happy.
This is it.
Yeah. This is an adult with normal hearing.
This is it.
She's very enthused. Oops.
This is it.
This is a post-lingually deaf cochlear implant user. So she, again, learned to speak and hear through normal acoustic channels and then got a cochlear implant later on.
This is it. This is it.
Yeah. Now, these 2 are very interesting. They are siblings, a brother and a sister. Both had Pendred syndrome, but the manifestation was a little different. The brother had some hearing at birth, and we have found that this is key. The sister was born deaf. The brother lost his hearing and got a cochlear implant by 6 or 7 years of age, but he had that hearing at birth. The sister had no hearing at birth and got her cochlear implant at age 1.5. So here's the brother.
This is it.
Sorry. Not happening.
This is it.
Okay, there we go. Right? Pretty good. And you see the separation here between the red and the blue. So here's the sister.
This is it. This is it.
So this was actually in our preliminary data set. And once we looked at this, we stopped including, we don't include children who have had hearing at birth because we treat them as, and we do test them, but we keep that in a separate file altogether. So you see how that early auditory experience could be quite important. So these are, I'm just showing you some acoustic analyses of the kids with cochlear implants and the kids with normal hearing productions. So the vertical axis here is, oh yeah, I have to go back to laser pointer. Okay, the vertical axis here is showing you the contrast between happy and sad. So this is mean voice pitch contrast between happy and sad. So the higher you go along the axis, the bigger the contrast is, okay? The green box plots are children with cochlear implants. The horizontal axis, these are our 20 sentences, okay? The blue box plots are the happy-sad contrast produced by children with cochlear implants. And you see this significant deficit in the acoustic contrast that these kids with cochlear implants are making compared to the kids with normal hearing. All of these kids with cochlear implants were implanted by age 2, okay? And none of them had any hearing at birth. So we see the same with other measures. So this is an example of intensity differences. We had thought that the kids with cochlear implants might compensate with intensity, what they are perhaps lacking with pitch, but there's still a deficit, and we think this might have something to do with device limitations as well. So I told you that we brought in listeners with normal hearing and had them listen to these productions and tell us if they sounded happy or sad. So here's some of those data. So these are the scores obtained by those normally hearing listeners listening to the CI Kids production. So that's the blue box plot here. And the green box plot are the same normally hearing listeners listening to normally hearing kids' productions of happy and sad. And you see that for the normally hearing children, it was harder to identify the intended communication of the kids with cochlear implants in terms of the emotions. So we're very interested. One of the things I wanted to point out, though, is that the words in the sentences that the cochlear implanted children are producing are highly intelligible. You saw that those kids, how well they said, "This is it," right? So this device is doing well. These are deaf kids, right? I mean, 30 years ago, this would not be the case. So we've come a long way, right? And we confirmed that by having listeners listen to those same productions and repeat back the words. So then we scored how well were the words communicated. And these kids are doing great. The mean there is something like 97% correct. So the kids are producing the sentences beautifully. It's just the emotion that is not being communicated adequately, right? So I'm going to summarize. Acoustic cues for voice emotion, as I said, includes multiple dimensions, but we do see that voice pitch is dominant, and that is what is not transmitted well through cochlear implants. We see that age and cognitive status are predicting the children's emotion recognition scores when cues are degraded for both normally hearing and cochlear implanted children. The sensitivity to voice pitch changes, so how sensitive in psychophysical tasks are children with cochlear implants predicts their performance with voice emotion recognition. And we are seeing from our initial studies of the productions of happy and sad emotions by children with CIs that there are deficits there. And we see that both in acoustic contrasts and in how well their normally hearing peers are able to identify those emotions. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to acknowledge people, though, first. These are our amazing lab. This is our collaborators in Taiwan. I haven't been able to present those data to you today for lack of time. Charles Lim's lab. Without these people, none of this work would happen. At Boys Town, we have such great colleagues. And, of course, NIH for funding. So, thank you.
We have time for one question.
Questions? I answered all of them.
So I'm wondering if you did any analysis by manufacturer of cochlear implant and whether the different number of channels or processing strategies had any effect.
So far, a couple of data sets where we have enough numbers to compare, we don't see any difference between processing strategy or device.
Thank you.
And that includes, the largest data set is with voice pitch sensitivity, and we have 97 kids total, including Taiwan and the US, and we see no differences across devices. And I'm not too surprised by that, despite claims by manufacturers.
Thank you, Manita. Okay. Our next speaker of the day is Professor Justin Armanoff. Professor Armanoff received his bachelor's degree in Spanish at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and his master's and doctorate degree in neuroscience at the University of Southern California. He then returned to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he's now on the faculty of speech and hearing science. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Justin Armanoff.
Thank you very much to organizers for inviting me here. One of the things that we've seen with cochlear implants has been really impressive improvements. So we have data over here that's really showing kind of the changes that we've seen since 1980 when, in the early days in terms of sentences that are understood or in terms of words. And there's been really just striking improvements. But if we look at more recent data, what we see, so this is data over here. We've got data from 1997, which kind of falls right on top of data from 2014, that we really haven't seen big improvements, at least for people who have one cochlear implant. Where we've seen a lot of changes has really been different populations, different changes, particularly things like moving to the use of bilateral cochlear implants. And as Matt mentioned, that we get some big benefits from having two ears. That it helps us in terms of understanding speech in a noisy environment. It helps us in terms of localizing where sound is coming from. And what we found with people who have two cochlear implants instead of two acoustic hearing ears is that those benefits tend to be smaller. So there's data from a lot of different tasks that's shown that. I have data here just from one task in the lab. This is localization data. So we're looking at how close you get to the target. So down is going to be better. What we have in the filled-in circle here is normal hearing performance. In the open circle is cochlear implant performance. I will point out the cochlear implant patients are still doing well. There are actually almost every single person who's come into our lab who has bilateral cochlear implants is able to localize better than chance. But as a group, they're doing worse, significantly worse than normal hearing listeners. And so we've really been interested in why aren't we seeing that full benefit? And we think that a major reason why we don't see the full benefit of having two ears for cochlear implant patients is that those two ears are really very different. And so even with patients who have the same device for their left and the right cochlear implant, can still have a lot of differences. We can see differences in terms of performance. They'll have better and worse ears. We can see differences in terms of how the sound actually is perceived. And we've looked at this in a number of different ways. One of the things that we've looked at in terms of how these ears differ is something called spectral resolution. So in a noisy environment, you're trying to separate out what you want to hear from that background environment. And your ability to do that really depends in part on your ability to tell apart small differences in terms of pitch and listen to different frequency regions of that signal. This ability to listen to these different frequency regions is something that we refer to as spectral resolution. So one of the questions that we've asked was, well, how different are the ears? Are they really able to pull apart that sound as well, both the left and the right ear? And so to test this, we looked at 9 bilateral cochlear implant users. And we completed a spectral resolution task. This is called the Spectral Temporally Modulated Ripple Test, or the SMRT. So this is a fairly straightforward test. I'm going to play 3 sounds. Tell me which one is different. Here's the first one. Second. Third. Which one was different? The third. You all passed. It does get harder. We actually make that difference smaller as the task goes on. But this is looking at how well you can tell those differences that are happening in the spectrum. Now, what's nice about this is it does correlate very well with speech. So when I talk about these results, this is data here from a study that we did recently, that we can actually give you a good prediction of what the scores are going to be on sentence tests. This was AZ Bio and plus ADB SNR. But so I'm going to also give you the predicted speech scores to give you a bit more of a reference in terms of what that difference really means. So these are the differences between all the different subjects for their left versus their right ear. So if the 2 ears are performing the same, then you see scores at 0. And in fact, we see quite a lot of difference. And it varies a lot from subject to subject. But in some cases, we're getting as much as almost a 25% difference in terms of the predicted speech and noise performance between the left and the right ear. So sizable differences that we're seeing. We've also looked at other spectral tasks. For instance, what about musical contours? So how well can you tell if notes are going up or down? So this is, again, looking at those same 9 bilateral cochlear implant users. And the task, this is one of the tests from Tiger Speech. You'll have different melodies. So that's an example where the notes are going up. Here's an example where they're going up and then going flat. Or they're going up and then down. So we're not concerned about what particular note we're playing. We're just, and those actually vary from trial to trial. What we're interested in is can you tell the direction of those notes? Are they going up or down or flat? And subjects just have to then click on what was that contour that I heard. And just like what we saw with spectral resolution, we see a sizable difference between the two ears. So again, 0 would indicate that they're getting the same scores with the left and the right ear. And again, our worst performer is at about here 25% difference between the left and the right ear. So not only do we see that this performance is different between the two ears, but we also see that the two ears really sound quite different. So one of the things that participants often tell us is they say, you know, this is my Mickey Mouse ear, and this is my rumbly ear, right? They hear kind of a louder, higher pitch sound in one ear, a more rumbly, lower pitch sound in the other ear. And so we wanted to look at, are they really hearing different pitches in these two ears? And so to look at this, we actually collected data from 16 bilateral cochlear implant users, and we did a fairly straightforward task, that we're asking them to compare the pitches that they hear for individual electrodes in the left ear and the right ear. So we'll stimulate one particular electrode in one ear, and then they actually have a dial where they're able to move around the stimulation in the other ear, and they keep moving it around and hearing the comparison until they say, yes, this is the same pitch. So the way I'm going to show a lot of the data here is schematically with these two different lines here. So the blue line is showing you where the left ear is, the red for the right, and I'm showing this in terms of just relative pitch. These aren't the actual notes on the piano. We don't have this external reference. But so there are cases where these two line up, where the pitches that you hear in the left ear overlap with the ones that you hear in the right ear. You also have cases where there can be differences, that the left ear might be shifted, for example, where you'll hear some lower notes than you'll hear in the right ear, and the right ear will hear some higher notes. So when we look across all the individuals, and this is showing kind of the relative pitches with the left ear shown in blue and the right ear shown in red, that we see quite a difference between the two ears. And the asterisks here indicate which cases we have a significant difference between the pitch that they hear in the left and the right ear. And for just about everyone we've tested, for 14 out of the 16 people, we found that at least for some parts of the electrode array, that they're hearing different pitches in the two ears. So it's a pretty consistent effect that we're seeing. And one of the things that this has gotten us interested in is looking at what their voices look like as well. And the reason for that is so much of what you produce is influenced by what you hear. And I'm sure you've had the experience where someone has a hearing loss that they might be yelling, they might be talking louder to compensate for what they're hearing of their own voice. We'll see that in terms of pitch. If I shift what you hear as the pitch of your voice, you will compensate and change your pitch in response to that. And so we know that they have the Mickey Mouse ear and the rumbly ear. And we have the question, well, do they have a Mickey Mouse voice and a rumbly voice? So what we did to look at this is a fairly simple task where we just have them say, ah. So they just hold out ah for about 5 seconds. And we'll do this when we're putting on their left cochlear implant, when we have just their right cochlear implant on. And we want to know, is this differences? We know they're hearing different pitches in the two ears. Does this then translate into different pitches that they're going to produce? So this is data from one individual subject. So going up in terms of y-axis, this is going to be higher pitches up here, lower pitches here. It's also coded in terms of color, where the blues are the lower pitches, the reds are the upper pitches, or the higher pitches. So this is one individual just saying ah when using their right cochlear implant. This is the same individual doing the same exact task, but now they're using their left cochlear implant. So we can hear those differences that we're seeing in terms of what the two ears sound like, looking at the voice as well. In fact, if we look across the individuals, here again we're showing the difference between the pitches that they're producing with the left and the right ear. And again, 0 would mean that there's no difference. To give you some perspective, most of the subjects have more than a 10 hertz difference, and this is what a 10 hertz difference would sound like. Some of these extreme cases are more than 25 hertz difference, and this is what that would sound like. So really, we're seeing quite a notable difference just as we're changing that input from the left to the right cochlear implant. Again, indicating that what they're hearing is very, very different in those two ears. Now, most of you probably don't walk around saying, ah. This is somewhat artificial task. And so we wanted to see, well, maybe we're seeing some artifact because we're asking them to do this really kind of odd task. And we want to see, well, do we see similar effects when we look at more ecologically valid tasks, more tasks that they'll do in their day-to-day life? And so what we looked at is singing. And I have to say, sometimes it takes a little convincing to get our cochlear implant users to sing for us in the lab. Many of them are a little hesitant. But we've got a number of them to come and sing happy birthday to us in the lab. Again, we'll do this when they have their left cochlear implant on or when they have their right cochlear implant on. And then we can look at the pitches of the notes that they're singing. So again, I'm showing here the pitches that they're singing in the left ear in the blue lines for individual subjects, in the right, with the right CI on in the red lines. The asterisks indicate when there's a significant difference between the two ears. And we do actually see, for about half the subjects, that we are getting different pitches that they're singing. I've got a couple examples here. So this is one subject here singing with their left cochlear implant.
Happy birthday to you.
The same subject singing the same part of the song with the right cochlear implant.
Happy birthday to you.
And here's another subject, again singing first with their right cochlear implant.
Happy birthday to you.
And this is the same part of the song, same subject, with the left cochlear implant.
Happy birthday to you.
Such a difference is almost the next verse of the song. That we're seeing considerable differences, again suggesting that what they're hearing with these two ears is very, very different. So why does this matter? What actually happens when the ears are mismatched? Well, one of the things that we've looked at is this idea of binaural fusion, the idea that signals coming from the left and the right ear combine together into one coherent sound. And for individuals with normal hearing, this can be a very, very solid effect to the extent that if you're trying to tell which headphone is not working properly, the only way to do that is to lift off one, then lift off the other, because the sound fuses so well together. For cochlear implant patients, that's not always the case. That often they don't fuse the sound together so well with the two cochlear implants. And we've been interested in how much of this ties into the fact that they're hearing different things in those two ears. So we've looked at binaural fusion. We've done that a couple ways. One of the ways that we've done that is using a cochlear implant simulation with normal hearing listeners so that we can carefully manipulate the difference in what they're hearing with the left and the right ear. And we just ask them, do you hear one sound or two? Is it fused together or is it not? And then we change whether or not and how much the two ears are mismatched. So we'll have cases like this over here, where the notes that they're getting, essentially, we're giving them speech tokens, but what they're hearing is all mapped onto the same parts of the piano in the left and the right ear. We'll also have cases where what they're hearing, we've actually mapped onto different regions, so that there's a mismatch in terms of what they hear with the left and the right ear. And what we find is that as we change that mismatch, as we go from covering the same notes on piano to covering different ones, that there's a systematic decrease in how well sounds sound fused, how much that they hear one sound versus two sounds. And by the time, and this is actually showing the relative proportion of the mismatch, it's fairly small over here, and at this point already half the time they're saying that, no, I'm hearing two completely different sounds, one in the left and one in the right. So this mismatch can have a pretty big effect in terms of how well those sounds fuse together. Now, mismatching actually can lead to other issues, particularly because of how we map cochlear implants and how that sound is encoded in those cochlear implants. So normally, each electrode is encoding a different frequency region, a different part of the piano. That this is actually showing the signal that each electrode is getting. This is all from one single speech signal, but now we're looking at those different frequency regions. And you can see as you move from one region to the next, that these signals look quite different. The way that we typically program these is we say that, well, electrode 1 in the left ear should get the same pitches as electrode 1 in the right ear. And so these signals will match up. But when you have cases where there's really a mismatch internally, so electrode 1 on the left ear is actually matching with electrode 2 on the right ear, what you start getting is now these places that are matched get mismatched signals. And so we've looked at, well, how does this affect it? Does this actually affect your ability to fuse these sounds together? So we've looked at this with 3 bilateral cochlear implant users, and we actually have them move a dial to change an image. So they start out with things looking very fused, a single dot in the center of their head. as they move the dial, it becomes kind of broader and spread out, and eventually it splits into two completely different sounds. So it can give us a sense not just is it fused or not, but there seems to be a lot of gray area where things are fused, but they kind of seem to spread out. And then we did this with signals where we either match that signal or we mismatch the signal, but we're sending it in all cases to the same location. So we found locations that people say are perceived as these matched locations, and all we're doing is we're changing the signal delivered to them. So down here is indicating that things are more fused. Up is indicating that things are split between the two ears. And what we find consistently is that as we mismatch these signals, that the sound starts to break apart between the two ears. So this mismatch is really having this negative effect in terms of how well things are able to fuse together. Now you can imagine that this can cause a lot of problems, the fact that you're hearing different things in the two ears. And one of the things is if you're trying to do any sort of task like singing, right? So imagine if you're trying to sing and you're hearing a different note in your left and right ear at the same time and trying to figure out what note do I go to when I don't know which note I'm actually on. And so we thought, well, it might be possible that having this conflicting information between the two ears is actually going to make it harder for you to do tasks like singing. And so to look at this, we tested, these are the same bilateral cochlear implant users I had singing before. We've just now added the condition where they're using both CIs together as well. And the way that we're looking at accuracy is we're actually correlating what the target is, what your typical contour for happy birthday is, versus what they actually sing. So we get a value of this. This is, it's called R, and the higher R is, the more accurate their singing is. The lower it is, the less accurate it is. So over here, this is an example of one subject. The notes here, the colored notes, are the notes that they actually sing. The open circles are what the target are. This is someone who's singing fairly accurately.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Delia. Happy birthday to you. So that's a fairly accurate contour for what happy birthday should sound like. You get a high R score. 1 is going to be the top that you can get. We have other people who have a lot more difficulty singing this accurately. So this is the data over here.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Delia. Happy birthday to you.
So that's going to be a lower R score, that the contour that they're singing is less accurate for happy birthday. So we can compare how well they sing that song using their better ear, and we're defining better ear based on accuracy alone. So we're not asking them, is your left or right ear better? We're just saying, okay, here's the accuracy with your left ear, here's the accuracy with your right ear. We're going to take whichever one is best. And the question is, well, what happens then when we add the two ears together? It turns out things get worse. That as a group, they get significantly worse. In fact, for 9 out of the 10 participants, we've got the best scores here in light blue and scores when they have both ears together in purple. That up is going to be better. That for 9 out of 10 people, they actually have more trouble singing this contour when those two ears are together. And we think that this is really coming from the fact that they're getting this different information with the left and the right cochlear implant. Now, mismatches also affect other things outside of spectral tasks alone. So as Matt mentioned before, that there's a couple binaural cues that we look at. One is inaural time difference, this idea that a sound coming from one side is going to arrive at, if it's coming from the left, it'll arrive at the left ear before it arrives at the right ear. The other is inaural level difference, so the fact that your head is blocking some of that sound, so that something coming from the left is going to be louder at the left ear than it will at the right ear. And so we wanted to see, well, what is the effect of this mismatch on these binaural cues? And so we looked at this with 5 bilateral cochlear implant users, and we wanted to see how sensitive they are to timing and level differences as we systematically mismatch the stimulation between the left and the right ear. And we did this for a number of different locations throughout the cochlea. And so the task, what they have to do is they're going to hear 4 sounds. The first and the last one always have no ITD, no ILD. These are your reference sounds. One of the 2 in the middle has a non-zero ITD or ILD. That's the one you're listening for, and you just have to say which of the 2 in the middle was different from everything else. So we can get different scores as we pair different electrodes together. So in this case, we have in the right ear, we're using electrode 11. And then we're looking as we compare it with electrode 4, as we compare it with electrode 5, all these different electrodes that we compare it to. And what we're seeing here is differences in terms of how small an ITD you can detect. So down here means you're detecting a smaller ITD. And what we're taking as what is the matched location is just whatever gives us the best score. That's where it's optimally matched together between the two ears. We can do a similar thing in terms of loudness difference. We get similar functions. And again, we're looking for where things are best matched between the two ears. So this is the data where we aggregate across all the subjects and all the locations. That here up is better. And what we look at, when we look at that best place, that we're getting on average scores that are around 600 microseconds. And 600 microseconds are kind of right on the edge of what is usable. It's not going to give you a lot of difference because that's the biggest difference that you hear. But even the best case scenario, they're getting maybe a little something, but really they're right on the edge of usable ITDs. But as soon as we do a mismatch, things drop very, very quickly, and they kind of stay down. That there's this rapid fallout with even fairly small mismatches. And this is consistent with what other people have seen in the literature as well. And early level differences tend to be a little more forgiving, that they tend to gradually go down. And again, this is consistent with the literature, that mismatches have a negative effect, but it's not the same as the effect on ITDs, where they really kind of make everything fall apart very, very quickly. So mismatches are very prevalent. They're very detrimental. And one of the questions we've asked is, well, can CI users just adapt to these mismatches? Can they learn to listen with two ears? And I think really one of the assumptions when we fit bilateral cochlear implant use, and I would say I'm not an audiologist, so this is truly an assumption, is that based on our experience with cochlear implants, we've kind of had this mantra that the brain will fix it, right? That we give this input that is not that great an input. And within about 6 months, it goes from sounding robotic and terrible to being understandable, being more natural sounding, that the brain fixes a lot of the things that are poor in the signal that we're actually providing these patients with. And so it makes sense to say, okay, we know there's lots of problems. We know we're not able to match up the signal in the left and right ear. We know that we can't insert that electrode ray in the same depth. The brain will figure it out. And so that was our question. Will the brain figure it out? Will it just fix this problem for us? And so to look at this, we took individuals right after activation, or as close to activation as we could get them, and then we followed them for a year. And we did the same pitch matching task that we did before, where they're hearing stimulation on one electrode in one ear, and then they move the stimulation in the other ear until they find where it matches up. So this is example data from 2 subjects, that at activation, you can see the red and the blue line look quite different, that there is a sizable mismatch in terms of what they're hearing with the left and the right ear. Over time, that mismatch actually decreases to a point where they're getting much closer in terms of what they're hearing with the left and right ear. And you can see the same thing with this subject over here. And that's a pattern that we see as a whole, that in general, over a period of a year, they go from things being fairly mismatched to being less mismatched, that they're at least partially adapting to this mismatch. But that doesn't mean that the brain will fix it all. So this is that same data that I showed from the 16 subjects looking with bilateral cochlear implants, looking at this pitch matching task. That these are some subjects who have quite a lot of experience. So we have subjects who have 4, 5, even 12 years of experience, where we're still seeing a significant difference in the pitches heard with the left and the right ear. So even though the brain is able to at least partially get you there, it's able to deal in part with these mismatches, it's not able to solve it all, that you're still left, even after many, many, many years, with this mismatch between what you're hearing with the left and the right ear. So I want to predict a little about where maybe it's aspirational, where I hope the field is going in terms of cochlear implant users, or at least in terms of bilateral cochlear implant users. I really think where we need to go as a field is to start thinking about bilateral maps. So instead of programming people with each ear separately, we maybe do some loudness matching between the two. We really need to start thinking about how can we treat bilateral cochlear implant patients differently than we've been treating our unilateral cochlear implant patients to really maximize the benefit that they get. Because we know time is not going to be enough to overcome some of these unique issues that bilateral cochlear implant users have. And so one of the things that we've looked at is, well, can we change the way that we program these devices? So if we know that electrode 3 in one ear sounds like electrode 4 in the other ear, can we change how we program it so that electrode 3 in the left ear and electrode 4 in the right ear get the same information? Since they're going to these matched locations, they're what sounds the same. What if we just corrected on the end of the map? And so we've looked at that with 7 bilateral cochlear implant users, where we either do what's done clinically, where we just say, okay, regardless of where these are inserted, regardless of how they match, we're just going to say electrode 1 is electrode 1. It doesn't matter which ear. We're going to give it the same part of the piano, the same frequency allocation. Or we're going to use our pitch matching data and say, okay, these different electrodes are the ones that match up. We're going to change our frequency, how we program these devices, so that they get the same information on those electrodes. And again, we're comparing performance with the spectral resolution task that we used before. So this is the data here. Anything above 0 would indicate that creating these maps based on pitch matching is improved performance. Anything below 0 would indicate that the way that they're done clinically yields better performance. And what we find is that for every subject that we've tested, and I'm sure we will eventually find ones who that's not the case, but we found that it is actually better performance that we're seeing when we program them to try to account for these differences between the 2 ears. So in conclusion, bilateral cochlear implant users have 2 very, very different ears. And this mismatch between the 2 ears can have really detrimental effects in terms of performance. And we know that the brain will fix some of it, but it won't get us all the way there. That what we really need to start thinking about is changing the way that we program these devices to really optimize the performance that we get. And I want to thank my lab members, the funding agencies, and of course our subjects who spend days and days in the lab listening to beeps. So thank you very much. So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you. That was interesting. So I'm wondering, when you did change off of the numeric, were you using, was it some type of experimental software, or were you using like frequency allocation, changes to the frequency allocation tables for the implants to be able to match from ear to ear?
So we actually do. We have special software from the companies that let us do, but you could do it. It depends on the system. So in Medel's system, you could actually change them to make everything match up. Depending on how you're doing it, it's harder to do it with AB's system. Cochlear actually has a nice platform for being able to do it. So a lot of what we change could have been done with the clinical software. We happen to use the special research software to do this because it gives us a little more control over it.
Yeah, that's nice.
Hi, thank you. Were any of the subjects simultaneously implanted bilaterally, or were there differences? And if so, what was the average, maybe, time between the first implant and the second implant?
So we do tend to have a mix, although much more sequential implants. I don't know the average off the top of my head, but more of them, I believe, are sequentially implanted.
Thank you.
When we learned that when they get the second implant, we spend time training a child with using the second implant alone. Is there a point to that, or is it better using both for the matching factor, or?
I don't know. The short of it is it's a little muddy whether it makes a difference. I mean, there's a good argument that you should be training them if they're bilateral, that we should be training them with both ears together. I think there's not strong evidence that we should be turning off the first one so that they don't rely on it. There's some indication maybe. My feeling is probably that's not the way to go. If we want them to learn to use it together, then we need to work on it together. But I would say that there's still a lot of debate in the literature on that.
Okay. So I know that there's also some debate about using imaging to look at electrode interference in terms of bleed. That was kind of discussed earlier. Is there some thought to combining kind of the two to make sure we're not having a bleed between near channels and then matching the channels as kind of a mapping technique to help with this too?
Yeah, so there are groups working on trying to use these imaging data to change the way that we program that, and it could potentially help you in terms of deciding how to match these up. One of the challenges with matching these up is it turns out that every metric you use gives you slightly different answers. So I've been talking matching in terms of pitch matching. When we look at it in terms of ITD or ILD, and I'm sure imaging as well, they give you different answers. And the question is, which is the right one to use? I think imaging is a potential one. It doesn't show a lot in terms of really how many neurons are actually surviving, and even if you know where the electrode is, you need to actually know where the neurons are, and that's something we're not getting from imaging, so I'm not sure how far that's going to get us, how close to an answer, but I think it's definitely an alternative.
Okay, last question over.
Okay, this is sort of more of a statement question. I want to disagree with what you just said about building up the skills in the second year. I don't know what the effect would be for pitch matching because I haven't looked at that. But for speech perception, if a person has had an implant in one ear for a long time, and I don't know what that definition of long time is, and then gets an implant in the second ear, we need to, my experience as a clinician for a lot of years is that we need to build the skills, speech perception skills in the second ear. If we don't do anything about it, the second ear always has poorer speech perception for long term. And I'm not talking about taking the first ear off for a length of time, but for a couple of hours a day, listen with the new ear and build those skills for a few months and then see what happens.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, that's excellent, and we can continue the discussion with each of the speakers after lunch at the after session, after symposium sessions that we have after lunch. And now I would like to invite Professor Coupel back up to the stage to present to you all.
I'm not going to do the overview of binaural hearing again. But it is the case that this might be unnecessary. Justin and I do such similar work that I guess I don't even, we could just start with questions, I suppose, or maybe I should redo the first part. I'm Matt, by the way. Thanks for coming this morning. Have you heard the one about the extroverted physicists? They look at your shoes when they talk. I also repeat myself when I get nervous. I learned that from a great electricity and magnetism professor. So. Okay, so to start, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we've talked about cochlear implants where there's been an imbalance. What about if it's a child with a unilateral hearing loss? Does this apply in the same way? And how are they impacted because of the unilateral hearing loss? And has that been studied?
Unilateral hearing loss. So that's a very good question. So maybe with that question, I'll answer that first after my talk. It does seem like I do have to give my talk now. Okay. So we talked about binaural hearing, why binaural hearing is important. This is the problem that we have in front of us, right? We have a lot of people around. It's the summer. We all want to be in Paris, right? We all want to be hanging out and watching the World Cup, and you know, it's really nice there. It's much more mild. But this is an incredibly demanding situation for someone with hearing impairment or hearing loss. I mean, imagine what it took in 1900 when Monet was painting this picture, and you know, some of these people, obviously, you know, like this one back here, she has bilateral cochlear implant. Well, no, actually, they didn't have bilateral cochlear implants back in 1900. They only had unilateral because they actually carried the processor around on a cart, and it was just too much work to bring 2 carts. Okay, but we want people to be able to enjoy themselves in these social situations, and these noisy situations. They happen all the time, and people avoid these situations when they have hearing impairments. Whether you have, for example, I'm going to talk about cochlear implantees for the most part. Even with bilateral cochlear implants, it doesn't solve all the problems. So to remind you of what I talked about at the beginning, binaural hearing helps us with sound localization. And we think about ITDs and ILDs, and it helps with speech understanding and noise. And there are these multiple components: head shadow, summation, and squelch. And we wanted to organize these noisy scenes. We had this great picture here about how at the ears you get this mixture, and yet the brain pulls all these things apart. But we're using these devices. You know, we got a cochlear implant, you got these electrode arrays. We're going to be putting them in people's cochlea, and then there's these external sound processors. So by the way, I'm always think like a professor and teaching undergraduates. So you know, I always have to start from the very beginning on everything. So even though most of you understand cochlear implants, it's just me. I got to start at the beginning. You got to remember that the main purpose of getting a CI is improving speech understanding, improving communication. That's why we give them to people. And so it's wrong for me to start with, oh, I want to maximize binaural hearing, right? And that doesn't work if there's some consequence to your ability to understand speech. And so we think about all of these stages that go on, right? So you got your processor here with a microphone, and there's a fancy computer algorithm, speech processing algorithm, that breaks apart the signal, transmits a code through this coil to the internal device, and then it breaks apart the signal in a frequency-specific way. That's the idea, is that it's supposed to mimic what happens in typical hearing. And then the question is, you know, I'm going to start with adults with bilateral implants. And so the question is, you know, like, well, what's the big benefit? 1/2. Are we getting a big benefit? Is it important? It's not necessarily standard of care, right? For adults, for sure. For children, we're often giving these children bilateral implants. That makes sense to people. I don't know how much evidence there is behind it. For adults, also the same case. So here are some data, right? Here's some data. Here's speech understanding, and these are for sets of easy sentences. So these are CRM sentences. This call response measure, there's these Air Force kind of sentences. Ready, Baron, go to red 3 now. So it's a pretty small, closed set. So those are the easy sentences. There's IEEE sentences. They don't make a lot of sense. They're much harder. Here are a bunch of individual data. Here are average data. And then I've sorted them out in terms of poor ear and better ear and both ears together. And you know, the poor ear isn't always the right ear or the left ear, for example. I just sorted them so that they make sense. And so most people do really well. You know, even our worst performers can do these easy sentences, getting colors and numbers at a pretty high level in their poor ear at 70%. But if we come over here to these hard sentences, this is what's really important to look at. I color-coded them such that I said the blue people are people who have very similar ears, okay? So that means that the poor ear and the better ear have less than 20% difference, okay? So that might seem like a huge difference to you, but for me, I was like, yeah, 20%. People have done that before. That's pretty similar. You know, you get people here at the very top, and they're getting 100% in both ears, and then you add both ears together, and they're still getting 100%. These are the superstars, right? And that's the people that often come to my research program, the superstars. These are the people that love their cochlear implants. They love doing the test. They'll listen to weeks of beeps, right? I mean, I honestly, this one at the very top, last week she was in for 40 hours listening to beeps. A whole week, right? Beep, 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 beep. She's also the kind of person that if I gave her a sound localization test where I conveyed only intraoral time difference cues, something that we know people with bilateral implants have a really hard time with typically, she's the superstar. She can actually localize with those. She's had a ton of practice. She's really the best. And she can, if we play the stimuli correctly, detect the smallest differences between intraoral time differences between the ears down to like 10 microseconds, right? That's as good as someone with typical hearing. So she's really the best. but she's also had a lot of practice, and she's our superstar. You get some other people, though. You get some other people here. You know, this person's interesting, right? So here's a person who, they're not doing overall that well. You know, 50% speech understanding here in their poor ear. You add in the better ear, you get 60%. Okay, so you know, each ear alone, you know, they're understanding speech, but then you add them both together, and then you end up getting even more bang for your buck. That's what you want to see, right? You want to see these curves when you add the two implants together to be greater than any of the individuals, right? And so these are the types of people. Another participant of ours, a good friend, you know, she's actually one of the first people that I tested. She says that her bilateral implants are complementary. One fills in the gaps of the other. I can understand speech in this ear pretty well. I can understand speech in this ear, you know, it's okay. It kind of sounds like Mickey Mouse. But when I put them together, there's something about it that they fill in the gaps of each other. So maybe there's some parts of the speech sounds that, you know, they're non-overlapping. And that's what's causing these big improvements bilaterally. But it's the kind of thing that we also can't see very well if we look over a large group, say 25 people, right? You know, if we actually do the statistics here, you know, we don't see a large benefit from both ears compared to the better ear alone in quiet. And that's part of the struggle that we have as a field, right? Producing evidence for adult bilateral cochlear implantation. Is it giving us a lot of bang for our buck? Well, for some people it does, right? You know, for some people it does. Now, there are some other people in here. I want to look at these. Look at this right here, this person. 0% speech understanding in their poor ear, near 100% speech understanding in their better ear, okay? These people aren't necessarily the most happy with their bilateral implants. And specific, you know, a specific person here, and we're really lucky to get them in because they're not going to want to do research. They don't want to listen to beeps for 40 hours. They don't see the benefit of bilateral implantation. This is the type of person who she got an implant at 1. She got her second implant at 10. And the second implant doesn't provide any speech understanding, right? You know, so this is a big problem. And so, again, in our field, we say that sooner is better. And there's kind of the question about, well, you know, is there too long for that second ear? And, you know, what kind of rehabilitation do we need for that second ear? And so this is with respect to speech understanding, and then there's all these other binaural questions. So, you know, the question here then becomes, okay, this is speech and quiet, and it's kind of hard to see how we're going to move our field forward and produce good evidence for how we decide when and who gets bilateral implants as adults, okay? So this is the big story, right? You know, we got this natural tension. These devices are for understanding speech, and the question is, can we provide spatial hearing? Why would you get a second CI? CIs are meant to provide the speech understanding, and we're only seeing a small benefit at the group level when we look in quiet. But we have to remember that speech rarely happens in quiet environments, right? We want to be in Paris in these noisy environments having our lunch in a little bit. And so we got to consider communication in these noisy environments, and that's where we're going to see the advantages of binaural hearing. Okay, and so this is, you know, the natural tension, right? How do we reconcile these two things? How do we maximize our speech understanding and our spatial hearing to get the best functionality overall? Okay. And so just to remind everybody, these devices convey so little information. This is the visual analogy that's, you know, very common. You know, here are two pictures. You can tell these two pictures are different. But you might not necessarily be able to tell what these are. If we add a little bit of resolution, the images begin to take shape. So not only can you discriminate them, but you can also maybe identify them. And then you find out, you know, these are presidents, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. And so the idea is that we don't need a lot of information to be able to identify what these are. And you could probably, with a little bit of practice, identify all of the presidents that are only with 16 pixels high, you know. So this is kind of the amazing thing about sensory perception, is that you don't need a lot of information to do a lot with it. And then we need to change the question around, right? So now we got to say, okay, what do we need to do to take those things and then say, where are we hearing them in space, right? Okay, so I'm going to go back and just remind you all of what Justin was talking about, matching between the ears, and how do we think about this? Okay, so here we have our cochlea, it's unrolled, base has high frequencies, apex has low frequencies, you know, so we got this tonotopic tuning, this all goes up to the brainstem, we have these auditory nerve fibers, I've sort of arbitrarily numbered them here, and then we put this implant in, right? And so, you know, the idea is that this implant is to convey speech information. We program the device over the range of frequencies that are important for conveying speech. You know, exactly what Ryan McCreary was talking about. We want to think about conveying all those speech frequencies. But there's a problem. It's that there's a physical problem. You've got this snail shell that gets narrower in diameter, and you're trying to shove this rigid thing in, and so that implant array might not get very deep in there. And so what happens is that you don't necessarily get to the deepest portions of the cochlea, and so you get this mismatch now, right? You get these low frequencies, you get 200 hertz going to a place that should be 500 hertz. We're not activating these low frequency fibers anymore. And that's a big problem, right? So what do you do with this? You know, you still need those low frequencies. If you don't, if we just say, oh, well, let's just line up the colors. You know, that's all we need to do. Let's just line up the colors. We know it's a little shallow. Let's just start at 1,000 hertz or something like that. That doesn't work. You lose everything below 1,000 hertz. You wouldn't understand any vowels, right? Vowels are pretty important for understanding speech. So, you know, here's this tension again. You know, how do we handle this? And so we get this frequency to place mismatch. We're trying to convey speech. And so what we did here, there are different ways of measuring these things. Here's standard frequency allocation table frequencies. So this diagonal line here represents that. That's what we would normally map our cochlear implant listeners to, okay? And then if you look at these dashed lines here, you know, this is the standard insertion from somebody with a cochlear implant, either a Med-L type or a Cochlear type of device. And you see it's a lot higher, right? These are shallowly inserted, okay? But we just deal with it when we think about one ear. Now, we're actually moving in the direction of testing people who have hearing in one ear and a CI in the other, so someone with single-sided deafness. And so we did this task where we did some matching between the ears. And we said, well, you know, what kind of matches do we get with this other measure, right? We're not going to look at the X-ray, which is, you know, kind of geographical. Where is it physically? Let's look functionally. And so functionally, we see that a lot of these matches end up even higher than what we measured in the X-rays, which means the problem was even worse than we had thought before. We are mapping these devices to much higher frequencies than what would suggest would be important if we were trying to line up the frequencies binaurally. So, you know, it's this tension. And it doesn't happen just with these kind of rare cases in single-sided deafness. It also happens, we think it happens with bilateral CI users, and we saw some great data from Justin that suggested that too. And here's the idea. If you're a surgeon and you're trying to insert these devices, and most adults get implanted sequentially, right? Do you remember a year and a half previous, how far did I stick that array in? And the answer is no. So, you know, one might be a little bit more shallow than the other. And so you're going to get this mismatch. And so if you look at how the auditory nerve fibers respond, well, you get some current spread. And so there's an overlapping part at the brainstem, and that might be good for binaural hearing. But there's this non-overlapping part, and so that's probably not good for binaural hearing. And then there's all the problems with, how well do you sing Happy Birthday, and how well do you understand speech, and how do we reconcile all of these multiple goals that we're trying to achieve? And so we can kind of think about the wide array of populations that we're dealing with, right? And so here's this picture that I made, and I apologize that I didn't have room to put people with, like bilateral hearing aids on it. I think about cochlear implants. I'm sort of fixated. So physicists got this problem, kind of perseverating on certain topics they're interested in. I might as well tell another physicist joke while I'm here, So I'm interviewing for my job, and the chair of the department, communicative disorders department, says, Matt, you're a physicist. Why do you think you belong in a program that focuses on communicative disorders? And I said, well, as it so happens, I got my PhD in physics. I was surrounded by people with severe communicative disorders for years. So I am an expert in this topic. Okay. Okay, so here's how we think about this in terms of, someone with typical hearing, right? They have all of this matching going on, and all of these binaural brainstem neurons, they're all color-coded too, right? So they're all frequency tuned. We get this huge binaural overlap region. All of these inputs are perfectly lined up, and that means they're getting great binaural hearing. And then we can contrast that with over here, right? This is a bilateral CI user, and their overlap is sort of diminished, right? And it's only at these sort of higher frequency fibers, and so there's less overlap, right? So I'm kind of drawing this box about the overlap region between the two sides. But there's still some overlap, which means binaural hearing still should work, probably just not as well as someone with typical hearing. And then we can look at these cases in between, right? So this is someone with normal acoustic hearing in one ear, and the CI in the other. There's a lot of overlap here still, right? This is a fairly large box. So we have access to lots of neurons in these cases that could do binaural hearing tasks. But I think Justin's point is pretty important, that the way we program that cochlear implant might not align with what's going on in the other ear. And so maybe it's important to also think about programming these devices in such a way to align the two ears to do a good job of conveying the binaural cues. And then the population that probably has the hardest time with binaural hearing, even though they have two inputs, is this one. People with bimodal implants, right? So you get these low frequency neurons are still accessible through a hearing aid and amplification, but then you got completely different neurons here that are being activated by the cochlear implant. You can see there's this only little narrow box, right? And so, some people with bimodal implants can do a little bit of sound localization. A lot of them can't. But it makes a lot of sense to me that they shouldn't be able to do this very well if what is necessary to do this task is to have some frequency matched inputs. So we're thinking about this problem, and Justin showed something like this too. Here's sound localization, right? Here's sound localization error, so down is better. People who have typical hearing do a really good job at this task, whether you're younger or older. It's important to consider age. A lot of our adult bilateral CI users are older. And then you got bilateral CI users. There's a wide range, right? There are the people who are superstars. They're getting close to people with typical hearing. And you get people who just aren't doing really well, and they're not necessarily that happy with their implants. And then you got some people with single-sided deafness too, right? They have access to sound in both ears. Again, some of them are doing quite well, and some of them not so well. And so the question is, you know, in these cases, why would, you know, a lot of people say, well, why would someone get an implant when you already have hearing in one ear, you know? And it's a big question for us right now. The FDA says this is not a good idea. We don't know if it would actually make hearing worse. And so far the evidence is very mixed, right? You know, the evidence is like, some people love it. They're like, I love it. I got this implant because I was having problem with tinnitus. And it remediated the tinnitus, and so that's really great. And, you know, I can kind of get something, and it's you know, I'm getting something out of this implant. I'm hearing better than before. I like having my implant, and these are the people who are doing well that'll advocate for these sorts of things. But I can tell you a story about a guy who called me up. He calls me up and he says, I have single-sided deafness and I got an implant, and it was the worst mistake of my life. I got it because it was recommended by the surgeon. I have neuroma on my good ear, and it was sort of a precautionary thing that I should get an implant now just in case they have to do surgery down the road. And you know, I can't have it, I can barely have it on. I'll turn it on because I do have tinnitus, and it helps a little bit with that. But I have it turned down all the way because it sounds awful. It sounds, I can't stand it, right? And that's what we're worried about. And so that device was also programmed in the standard way. It's for understanding speech. But people with single-sided deafness, they understand speech with their good ear, right? They're not going to understand speech with that cochlear implant. The cochlear implant's doing something else, right? The purpose of that cochlear implant is to give them sound in both ears. So maybe we should, oh, well, we know that the arrays are kind of shallowly inserted, and it's more for some people. Maybe, what if we try to line up the two ears? So we brought this person in and played them beeps for a week, right? And so after a week of playing him beeps, we had a good guess about where that array was and what frequencies lined up. So we sent him over to the audiologist, and we said, can you please do this? And it was completely off the book, right? I mean, like, no audiologist textbook would ever say to map anyone like this, right? Because we didn't care about speech understanding. We just said line up the one ear to the other. And we turn on the thing. I love telling this story. People get sick of it. I tell this story all the time. It kind of cracks me up. I sort of get choked up a little bit. This is a grown man who said this was the worst decision of his life. And he cries with tears of joy. He's fixed, right? And he keeps coming back afterwards, too. That's important, you know, so he'll keep listening to beeps for us. But that's the thought process here. It's completely, you know, it's not how we were thinking about it before, because we're taught these things are for understanding speech. And when that happened, I realized this applies to everybody getting an implant and thinking about 2 ears. There are these cases of people with bilateral implants that I need to think about this more than before, okay? And it's all about understanding how the binaural system works. Okay, so just to, I got a few more minutes, yeah. Where we are right now, kind of like the state of the field, head shadow always works for bilateral implantees. It's kind of physics. So here is the change in speech understanding that you're going to get from typical hearing and a bilateral implant. You know, this is kind of approximated from the literature. This is taking the average over, say, like 25 studies from the last 20 years because we've measured this so many times. It's like 6 dB, right? Almost 40% speech understanding. People with bilateral CIs do get summation, just like people with typical hearing. It's very comparable. And then you get this unmasking component, and this is the where do I hear things part of this story, right? And this is where people with implants are falling far behind, right? People with typical hearing hear things at different points in space, and they say, I'm focusing on you, I'm ignoring them, life is good. And people with implants here, they're not getting a very big benefit, and that's because they're not hearing these distinct sound objects in space. And it's even worse than that, right? So we have, it's essentially what Justin was talking about. We need to line up the two ears. We need to make the signals as similar as possible between the two ears, because we can hypothesize the problem is blurriness. If you have differences between the ears, things sound blurry and you can't tell them apart at different places, right? So you have these sound signals, they're coming in, and you put implants on someone, and like Monita was saying, like that ruins the voice pitch stuff. So now you can't even tell the male from the female, and then these location cues get degraded, which then your signals are all kind of screwed up. And you can look away anytime you start feeling sick, because it's just going to keep going. And it has to do with all these things, right? It's about device factors, synchronizing the two ears, having them talk to each other, coordinating the ILDs and the ITDs, talking about the surgical differences, right? The implantation depths are different between the two sides. And the fact that we need to recognize that all of this is going through a system. It is the most sensitive system in the auditory system. The binaural system is made to detect differences. So our threshold for having differences between the two ears before it becomes consequential is incredibly low. So I'll move past this slide. Okay. Oh, great. So, I mean, here's the question, right? We want to hear things at different places. Can we maximize our speech understanding, particularly in background noise, by conveying spatial information? And so I was trying to convey this natural tension that we have, that we're trying to do multiple things at once, and we don't want to hurt one for the other. Right now, people with CIs are just worse at spatial hearing tasks, right? And we're not to the point yet where people are like getting such huge benefits that is good enough. And it's probably because of device coordination and differences between the insertion depths and lining up things between the two ears and creating the tools, the audiologist, to do bilateral mappings. Okay, there's a lot of blurriness that's occurring, which is why, you know, all these pieces of these people ended up in different places. And right now, we're not conveying interoral time differences. At the beginning of the morning, we said interoral time differences are the best. This is what we rely on as humans when you have typical hearing to do great binaural hearing. We're conveying mostly ILD information right now. And so this is where we are as a field, and moving forward, it's about researchers creating the solutions and the evidence for the audiologists and the techniques and the tools that can come from the companies to have good access to sound in both ears. There's a reason we have both ears, and to help us communicate better with speech in quiet and in noise. Okay, thanks. So let's start with the question that was at the beginning. Yeah, come back up, ask it again, just so we remember.
What about people that have unilateral hearing loss and no auditory nerves, so they can't have a CI in their other ear?
Oh, golly, yeah. I mean, that's just a bummer, right? You know, having two ears is the best. We all know this. Well, actually, with practice, you can do a pretty good job of learning some of the cues to localize. You know, there's lots of strategies to handle background noise about where you sit at a given table or pointing your ear. So even though I've set up the simple version of it is you need two ears to localize, that's not true. That with practice you can actually learn to localize with one ear, but it's not that great. But obviously someone without access to sound on the other ear, you know, that's a non-starter. There's no point in giving them an implant over there, right? Other questions? It's before lunch, so we'll just cut into lunch.
Thank you for sharing with us. I'm a rehabilitationist, an auditory verbal therapist, and I have been on a roller coaster all morning because in some instances I just wanted to cry. But in my practice, I've seen kids with not being able to do these things do fabulous things. But you mentioned this one superstar that with lots of practice and techniques, I want to see a value to my job because I see it practically. And I'm not a scientist, but I'm married to a physicist, so I get it.
Oh,
You're looking at things a complete different way. But has anyone looked at anything of the intervention and whether these people had any intervention to try to help to learn to listen binaurally? I mean, I understand that part of it's physiology and the devices and this, that, and the other, but there has to be some reason we do what we do and get the results that we get.
Right. Well, so I can broadly categorize sort of the bilateral cochlear implant literature. There's the big clinical studies with lots of people coming through the clinic, and you got speech understanding scores. So short tests that happen in the clinic, and you kind of get some idea of how the ears do work together or don't, but not exactly what you're speaking to. Then you got the things that I do, where I get 6 people and I test them for 10 to 20 hours and play them beeps, and it's really careful, and it's usually the superstars in the literature, and so there's kind of nothing in between, right? We need to bridge that gap. We need to go from here are the superstars, and here's the best, and here's the most controlled stimuli, and let's make it to what happens when we have a broader population and do things that involve training. But it's really hard right now because people are so variable and how they're receiving rehab, and we don't have the evidence, right? Because there's so much variability, we haven't developed any good evidence. Do you train with just one ear alone or not? I mean, it makes a lot of sense to do that study. I wish somebody would, and I'll probably convince myself to do it, but
The more we know, the more we don't know. I mean, that's what I always feel when I come here, but thank you for doing your work and sharing it with us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm not an audiologist. I do understand
Me too, I'm
that.
not an audiologist.
Yeah, okay, so I do understand that you were talking about a pitch mismatch and that the majority of the children were sequentially implanted. My question is, when you did the testing, had the bilateral balancing been done on those children?
It's still the case that we program the devices as 2 independent devices. And in any child or an adult, right, no one clinically has the tools to evaluate if there's any mismatch. We just don't have that. They can come do research, and then we can say, oh yeah, you know, you're a couple electrodes off, or we can do your CT scan, and oh, you know, there's a problem here. But we're now as a field, several groups, Justin's group, my group, other people are really thinking about this now, and so we're really at the cusp. You know, in a few years, we're going to know, are these types of interventions of fixing these mismatches in frequency tuning between the ears, is that going to be a good thing to correct, and how much is it going to help? But it's never a question that we've tackled before, so we're kind of, you know, it's a very exciting time for people interested in this.
Because from a clinical perspective, and I would ask the senior audiologist to come help me out, there is a procedure called bilateral balancing, which is done audiologically. So, but the problem is that it's a skill that comes as the child grows older. So you have a child who may be sequentially implanted very young, but he or she is not capable of doing the bilateral balancing till a certain amount of time passes. But that is very critical because clinically, we are actually doing what you are suggesting and you have the numbers for, but we are looking at it from the other side where we are matching it perceptually using the child's direct feedback.
So when you
I
talk
mean, I don't
about
know.
bilateral balancing, are you talking about loudness?
No, we're talking, I think I need some help from the senior audiologist here, but when we do the bilateral balancing, you're talking about matching the perception of the sound with one implant versus the other. So you're matching the, probably the second implant to the perception in the first one. So, and I know that from the children at our center, for example, there's been a change of just one current level, and they do perceive it as different. And that is fantastic, and that is because of auditory verbal therapy, and that is because of early intervention. So we're actually looking at the same problem, but from the other side. And there's a screen between us, so it would be nice if we just talk together. So that, yeah, because you're saying that we're saying the same thing, you're just coming up with the numbers, which we may not understand, but we are seeing it as a perceptual clinical practice.
I mean, I agree. I think that researchers should talk to clinicians more often because you all are in the trenches, right? I mean, I learned some of the craziest things. People, audiologists tell me all the time, they say like, well, so you know this happens. I was like, that doesn't happen. And there's no reason that should happen. We've never seen anything like that in the literature. Oh, yeah, no, this happens. I was like, okay, well, let's do a test. Oh, you're right, that does. I would have never guessed. Right? So I think there's a lot of good room for interaction because especially people with lots of experience develop all of these intuitions about, I think this is what we should do. And then we got to talk to develop the evidence to then make it standard in the field.
And there's just one last thing that with respect to single-sided deafness, like the most recent research that has come out, I think in the last 8 months or 6 to 8 months, is that there's been this whole argument questioning the validity of a cochlear implant with single-sided deafness as opposed to, say, for example, a cross-hearing aid. And what the research is showing is that the cross-hearing aid came up as being a better option up to 6 months post the intervention, whereas the cochlear implant, as reported by recipients, is being reported as being the better one, the better option, 12 months post-implantation. And that was from the point of view of localization and listening and noise.
Yeah, well, there's lots of people doing this sort of research now, and it's very mixed, so I think it's an exciting time. Right? So I think that we actually have a breakout session after lunch. I'm getting the hook, so.
We have time for 2 more quick questions, and then we'll come back after lunch.
I'm just curious, last time I looked, or actually my colleague looked, the slides were not posted yet for this session. Are they posted now? Are they going to be posted?
Have you posted the slides?
That would be awesome.
Yeah. I'm happy to share my slides with people. So if they don't get posted, you can email me, and that's fine.
I just had a question about your graph around better ear, poorer ear, and both ears. So most of your group looked as if having both ears was not much better than the better ear. But I'm wondering how you evaluated better ear and poorer ear, because that's one of our biggest reasons for recommending bilateral implantation, is because it's very difficult to know which is going to be the better ear ahead of time.
Yeah. Well, so
just checking.
I cheat, right?
Right.
Because they already have implants, so I just measure one and then I measure the other,
so
and then I say which one's higher, right?
Yeah.
So
it's not really a fair conclusion then that both is only marginally better than better because you didn't know what better was before you had both.
No, I think that it's fair, right? I mean, I think that the data are what they are.
Yeah.
But if I were to, I don't have any ability to predict the future, right?
Right.
And which would be a really important thing.
Yeah.
And it's mainly because everybody is different and it's kind of messy.
Yeah.
I do think, I do think, and we do have some papers about this sort of thing. We say as a field earlier is better. With an implant, earlier is better. And we probably are thinking most of the time about the first ear. And then there are people kind of like, well, do I get a bilateral implant? I think I'll wait. Maybe there'll be, some technological upgrade. And so then they end up waiting 10 or 15 years. Or, I hear this thing, stem cells and hair cell regeneration. But, that's a long way off. We see the biggest benefits from the second ear when we say earlier is better in the second ear too. Mm-hmm. So, when we get to that point, and we don't know as a field when it's like, do we jump in, but, it seems like everybody is saying, like, when it's time, do it, because keeping those neurons alive is probably the single most important thing.
It'd be really interesting to look at the people, once you've evaluated them as better in poorer ear, whether the poorer ear actually is their second ear or their first ear, if there's any pattern there. Most
of the time it is, but it's not always, so there's sometimes that it isn't, and it's just such a mixed bag, right? Everyone has a different story.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I'm sorry we're running out of time, but I'm really delighted that we have all of these questions, and we have the after lunch sessions to ask more questions with a more interactive discussion with the speakers. So please do come back. I do believe that we have had an absolutely fantastic session this morning, and I want to thank all of those who presented today. Thank you very much, as well as to those who organized the symposium and to the AG Bell organizers for arranging all of this. And I would like to thank all of the parents, families and professionals in the audience for your support to help those who have hearing loss to listen, speak and live their lives without limits so that they can go on to create their own successes in their lives to contribute to society around us. And so I would like to pass over the podium to Dr. Ted Meyer for some few closing remarks.
Thanks. Peter, thanks. On behalf of the association, we greatly appreciate both TLOC and Peter for their help and support, as well as the NIH. We greatly appreciate you being here, and we just have a small token to thank them for their help. These are autographed signed books by Dana. And again, come to the questionnaire session this afternoon. There will be lots of opportunity to ask questions of our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.